In this special episode, Sara representing Sequoia Samanvaya from Hudson Valley. Right now, she is from Tennessee, and our Ram from Rata Media in conversation on American Independence Day. Beyond fireworks, flags, national celebration, all this deeper meaning of July 4th, freedom and democracy, and its struggle that shaped the United States. This discussion also reflects on the contradiction within the idea of independence, who received freedom in 1776, um, and how has the meaning of liberty changed over time. Um, we are grateful here to invite Sara from Sequoia Samanvaya in conversation with Ram from Rata Media. Over to you.
Hi, Sarah. So welcome. Thank you for making the time and talking to us about. You have been doing this work for a quite long time now, sensitizing people about the entire idea of what is Independence Day, how independence has been for uh, the what does it mean, and what was the land that we call America today. So basically, what I wanted to understand today is uh, from an Indian perspective, we want to understand where is it that we have, how do you derive or how do you arrive at this understanding of an Independence Day in the American context? For the land itself, what did it mean? Because the land is much bigger, much older than the idea of the nation state as it emerged in the later part. So there was a civilization before, and that is the part that we don't get to hear about. Uh, because American Independence Day is now a global marketing phenomena. So even we have American Independence Day, July 4th sale
Really?
yeah. So there are people who celebrate by consuming
Do they
the
eat hamburgers and hot dogs?
I don't know what they consume, but I see advertisements selling all kinds of stuff to Indian consumers saying, okay, you celebrate American independence today.
Mm.
So for us, of course, our Independence Day, we know where it comes from, what happened, etc. But American independence from a Native American perspective and from the land zone idea that goes so far back, it is on that context, I think it will be great to hear because you have been telling that story and you have been working in the space of making people understand their own histories and renegotiating their own even identities at some level, and understanding things from a much broader perspective, not just in linearity of history, but also in terms of circularity of time. So that is where I think I would like to request you to
Mm.
start with that.
Mm-hmm. 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 Thank you. Well, thank you, Ram. Thank you, Bhaskar. I've been admiring your work from afar and the work you're doing at Thai Media for afar. And it's really good to see how much you've been doing and all the many good stories that you've been telling. So it's an honor to be talking with you today. I think I'd actually like to start. Um, this year marks that 2026 marks the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and it actually and the what becomes the Revolutionary War in the United States against the British, and the formation of the United States. And in the Indian history, 250 years is very small, is a very little amount of time. Um, in this history here, it's a big deal. So there's lots of fireworks celebrations. Before I so let me start earlier though. Let me start before 1776. Let me go back further because to kind of understand what happened in 1776, we have to go a little bit further back in time. And the history, you say your folks don't know all these histories. Well, my people here in America, we don't know most of these histories either. We tend to be an ahistorical people. We don't learn as much history as would be helpful, and as it would help us understand what's happening in our own place.
Do you mean you also learned that Columbus discovered America?
We also learned
that's what we
yes.
study in school.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So going back to that time of Columbus. So, prior this land prior to in some ways similar to India, prior to the Europeans coming here, there was hundreds and hundreds of indigenous languages and cultures and peoples. And with long established practices of self-governance and long established practices of sovereignty, and just a huge variety of languages, and tremendous biodiversity. And the Europeans, when they came here, they consistently would talk about how healthy the people here were, and how tall and strong, sometimes tall, sometimes strong, but frequently strong, and often how kind and generous. And just like the food that people ate was tremendously diverse and it sounds very delicious. And is very much a land of abundance. This was very, very much a land of abundance. And so the Europeans, as there's this thing in history called the doctrine of discovery, which in the 1450s is a set of papal bulls, a set of church doctrine that was signed by the Pope in Rome, which gave permission. It gave the moral, economic, political permission for what becomes colonization. First in Africa, along the west coast of Africa, and then subsequently in the Americas. And they talked about this in using the language of discovery. If you discover something, if the European power discovers something, then they have the quote unquote right to subdue and enslave the people and to take all those resources for themselves. And there's some theological, this is sort of based in some particular understanding of Christian theology, of Christian doctrine. And that's a whole conversation. We can get into it at some other time. But just to say that there was a search for greater material wealth and power, and that the doctrine of discovery enabled this to happen. And so when Columbus goes out, he's going out. He himself comes from a family of people who enslaved who were part of early forms of enslavement, and he goes out with the idea that he can subdue and take whatever he finds. He goes with a presumption by the time he gets there. And as you know, he was searching for India. He was searching for your country. He was searching for spices. The European food was relatively bland, and he comes to these islands. He doesn't actually land on continental U.S. He lands in the islands, and his first comments about the people when he writes in his journal is how kind and generous they are, and how they'll be very easy to conquer, and they'll be very easy to subdue. And he brings, and so he's searching for gold. And one of his famous quotes is that gold is next to God. To get into, if you have enough gold, you can really get into heaven. This is very close, what we now call the prosperity gospel. There's a very close association in his thinking and in the thinking of many explorers like him, that if you have that the way to heaven is through gold and through conquering. So I think of this as like the god of war, right? He's kind of worshiping a god of war here, not a god of peace. And that doctrine of discovery 150 years later, influences the entirety of the Americas. It influences the entirety history of colonization, including eventually the colonization of India. 150 years later or so, the British begin exploring. Columbus himself was, comes from Spanish and Portuguese history roots, and Italian. He himself was actually Italian, but so from Southern Europe. And about 150 years later, the British begin to explore, and they come into what is now known as America. And they bring with them this notion of cultural superiority, that they are superior to the cultures in America that they find and that they encounter. And the English settlements are trying to be settlements in the early stages. They're not just trying to do trade. They're also trying to settle to stay. And that was in the 1600s, early 1600s. And of course, they find people, the native people, indigenous people, and the Wampanoag people in what's now Boston and Cape Cod area, which is where the Mayflower lands. And those people, in many ways, helped them survive. Like the Puritans and the English who never would have survived those first few years, much less the decades that follow, without the active support of native peoples. And that's everything from, particularly around food and survival and what food to eat and how to grow, because they started growing corn and learned how to grow corn. And corn was a native crop, right? It's not from Europe. It's not part of the European food. Much of the story, as you can tell, is a story about food, because life is a story about food. So there's when the colonists and the missionaries that come with the colonists and the settlers are coming into this country, they write home about what they find. And so it's from those colonial accounts and those letters that we get a picture of both what was here and how they experienced it. And so I already mentioned how abundant this land is. They also talked about how free the people were. And they taught, and many missionaries wrote in many different ways that, so one missionary wrote, "I do not believe that there is any people on earth freer than they." Now, the Europeans didn't actually know very much about a lot of people on earth at that time. But the notion, the idea that came again and again was that there was this level of freedom. And quite frankly, the freedom really horrified the missionaries and the early colonists. It went very much against their society, because European society in the Middle Ages and at that time was very, 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 very hierarchical. And it's hard to overemphasize. It was extremely hierarchical. And there was a disparity between the upper classes and the lower classes, but I'm actually mostly talking about the hierarchy that was so deeply embedded in European society. And I'm going to just read you one or two quotes from the missionaries at that time, because I think that this it's kind of astounding, I think, in our modern mind to understand this. So one missionary who was working in Nova Scotia, Father Pierre Biard, mostly the Jesuit missionaries, the Mi'kmaq, this is a community in Nova Scotia in Canada, consider themselves better than the French. For they say, "You are always fighting and quarreling amongst yourselves while we live peaceably. You are envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor." They see themselves as richer than the French. The French had more material possessions, the Mi'kmaq conceded, but they had other greater assets: ease, comfort, and time. And another quote, they reciprocate hospitality and give such assistance to one another that the necessities of all are not seen as being are such as any beggar in their towns and villages. They consider it a very bad thing when they heard it said that there were in France a great many of the needy beggars, and thought that this was for lack of charity in us, and blamed us for it severely. Another missionary says of the Montagnes Nascapi peoples, this is in 1642, they imagined that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild as coats, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever, except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times because they fear our captains, while they laugh and make sport of their own. All of the authority of the chief is in his tongue's end, in how good his speech is. He is only as powerful as far as he is eloquent. So they're describing a much more democratic, a much more participatory society. And the early towns and forms of self-governance, indigenous people had a lot of, throughout the Northeast seaboard, throughout the woodlands, peoples had a lot of, town, what we now call town meetings, and some basic land management practices. There was tremendous, the women had a lot of freedom. Remember, women in Europe at that time were effectively property of their husbands, whereas women in the indigenous communities could divorce their husbands at will and had tremendous freedom over their body and could enter into sexual relations as they wanted. They were not, like, the idea of women being property was just unheard of.
But
And so there's just like, yeah,
no,
go
I
ahead.
just want to pause a bit here because this sounds a lot like what happened in India also. Because when some of the narrations of the 18th century British narrations of India, even the earlier ones, 17th century, 16th century kind of thing, the first narrations of India are about the abundance and how easy people are and how generous they are. There is some parallel here that I see. Two interesting things when I was listening to you, what I kind of came to my mind is they had this doctrine of discovery. The Europeans had it, that whatever was discovered by them, they could own it, including people, right? So, and you said this could have been applicable in Africa and even in the case of India, wherever they went. So, though it was granted during
Africa. And then when Columbus came to America in 1492 and he returned in 1493, a second set of papal bulls was written, which kind of did the same
okay, so there was
thing, but for
one
the
more.
Americas. There's a series of documents, and at the time they actually didn't call it the Doctrine of Discovery. They actually called it donation bulls, but that's more detail than we need to get into today.
Okay, so my one observation or question here is where because primarily this is exploratory kind of and from, if I have to talk from an Indian point of view, when invaders came, we don't call them discovery, we call them invaders. From
Yeah,
our point of view,
right.
and
Yeah.
we don't call it as ownership, we call it plunder. Okay, we call it that the invaders came and plundered this land. That is how we call it. So, when we talk about it then that manner, are you saying that the discovery and ownership, these two things that you mentioned, if the religion had a big say in the European society on what you discover and how you ownership of it, did religion have a commanding presence over every other aspect of the European society at that point in time? Would it have given how they did it within, for instance, if the European society were to discover something within Europe, would it be different from how it would be in other parts of the world?
Interesting. So first, I think that the language of plunder and evasion fully fits what happens in America, in what we now call America, which at that time was, the native peoples throughout this land.
What did the
Many,
native
many
people call
peoples,
this land?
many people called this land Turtle Island.
What
I don't
island?
know if the Turtle Island, that was
Turtle
the
Island. Okay.
Turtle Island. That's what many communities called it. Not everyone. I don't know if there is one term used by everybody, right? There's a very diverse group of people. But that's one of the more common terms is Turtle Island. And certainly people would have experienced it from the islands in what's now the Caribbean, the Taino people who first met Columbus up north and down south certainly would have experienced it as plunder and invasion. And so that form of Christianity, and I'm always careful because there's many forms of Christianity, and Christianity plays a very complex role in all of this history. But the form of Christianity that we can associate with what an indigenous scholar, Stephen Newcomb, calls the domination code. There's a code of domination, and it's embedded in certain types of Christian language, and it becomes embedded in the legal thinking of first of the European powers and subsequently of America. The United States takes on the doctrine of discovery after its formation. It's embedded in U.S. law, and it's actually the foundation of U.S. property law. U.S. property law could not exist without the doctrine of discovery, without this colonial concept, because U.S. property law property systems in the United States depend upon the United States government having a quote-unquote right to someone else's land. It depends upon the erasure of indigenous land rights. That's the only way that property law here can exist. So it's foundational for property law, and therefore is foundational for the United States. And so, to your question about it was hugely important. Could they discover something in their own country? I don't know how. What I do know is that at the same time as the doctrine of discovery was happening, there were what we now call the Great European Witch Hunts, in which thousands of women were burned at the stake, and many of those women had, not all of them, and the history of it's also complex, but many of those. These were European women in small villages all across Europe, and they were burned. Their own people, their own communities burned them, and many of them had what we might think of today as traditional ecological knowledge. They had knowledge of local herbs and medicines, and that's another story we can get into, but. So we do know that there was a destruction of European and traditional knowledge and ways of knowing, not just the knowledge itself, but the ways of knowing, that was also being destroyed at a very, very similar time period that we see what becomes the destruction of traditional ecological knowledge and ways of working with Earth around the world. So there was some of this was happening internally in Europe, as well as externally. There's some ugly history here. And for what it's, the histories, none of this is the histories I was brought up with, right? Like my family are amongst the founding fathers of the United States. and my family's been here for a long time, and we were always taught a history of success, really, and of victory, and of doing something really cool. And so, like that we created a country based on a set of ideas. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that, but there's also, it misses a really big part of the story. It misses a much, much bigger story that was also unraveling at that same time. Does that help to answer your question, Ram?
Yeah. So, sorry, it came out of what you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
but you are trying to give a overview of how it arrived at the Independence Day. I mean, how did July 4th? What happened?
Right.
July 4th of
Right.
this.
So
Yeah.
this is and in the beginning, Native peoples here were called Americans. And it was understood that to be an American was to be Native. And over time, as the English settlers, particularly the English, but also French and other European settlers, settled here and stayed here, and as the power shifted, in what we call 13 colonies, kind of became stronger. The term American became increasingly, it was often used to refer to the English people, to the settler communities. So the term has changed its meaning over time. And so the settlers pushed the Native peoples out, right? They took their land. They brought with them disease, which really disrupted a lot of the community. Diseases wiped out a third of the population, roughly. So a huge loss through disease. And so the Native peoples, the indigenous peoples, they pushed them out and took over the many places. But even in that context, even the context of disease and land thief and grabbing land, the Native diplomacy and Native people still had a lot to say. And they still had a lot of influence over how things were done, especially in the early years. And the people knew each other, and so there's this relatively new book called The Dawn of Everything, which kind of charts some of this history. And one of the arguments of that book, and it's an argument that fits my experience and it fits the indigenous elders I've been listening to as well, who've been saying similar things. And they argue that the indigenous critique of European society significantly contributed to the Enlightenment. That the Enlightenment in Europe, the French Enlightenment in Europe, probably would not have happened had it not been for the indigenous criticism of Europe. And but what's confusing here, or what's complicated here, is that criticism was in some ways indirect, because a lot of it was being reported by missionaries more than spoken by indigenous peoples themselves directly to a large European audience. So there's this weird kind of translation issue that happens, and I think similar things happen in India as well. It's hard to, but nevertheless, even with some translation issues, the indigenous critique of Europe challenged how Europeans, and particularly the British, saw themselves. And that the ideas there of equality in particular became, it was a new idea for Europe in terms of in practice. They had some ideas of equality in Greece and Rome, but in Europe, it was really a new idea. I'm going to just fast forward on this history really quickly to say that by the time that the Europeans in the 1700s, the settlers in the U.S., what we now think of as the U.S., the 13 colonies, were beginning to be disgruntled with being under British rule. They were beginning to question it and beginning to be uncertain. And there was a series of treaties and meetings that were happening with Haudenosaunee people, as the people in the northeast of New York State, what we now think of as New York State. And and it through a series of conversations, and many of the chiefs and leaders of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which are also known as the Six Nations of the Iroquois, or at that time Six Nations of the Iroquois, that they strongly encouraged the nation, the colonists, to come together as one nation, to come together as one people. And Chief Constantinogo, who was of that, from that time, he strongly encouraged the colonists to come together. And he gave the example of the 13 of arrows. He holds a bond of like a bundle of arrows in his hand, and he says, one arrow alone you can break, but when you bind these arrows together, it is very hard to break them. And this is a traditional indigenous symbol of unity. And that symbol becomes one of the most important symbols of unity for the colonists. And at one point, George Washington walks through this, one of the leaders of the American Revolution and the first president of the United States walks through, rides his horse through towns carrying a bundle of arrows to symbolize that they have come together in unity. And that bundle of arrows is still on the official seal of the United States of America. It's held in the hands of the eagle. So if you there's just so many ways and then the Haudenosaunee people effectively help to teach the settlers, the colonists, the Continental Congress, how the structures of government that are necessary to form a governance structure that's not based on an authoritarian leader. Because while the ideas of democracy were in Greece and Rome, there was no practice for over 1,000 years in Europe of something that resembled democracy, of something that resembled participatory governance. They didn't know how to do it. They had memories from Greece, but those memories were old and not particularly effective. So they would listen, Ben Franklin and John Hancock and many others would listen and paid a lot of attention to how particularly the Haudenosaunee, but also other indigenous nations were self-governing themselves because they didn't know how to do it. And so during the actual Continental Congress, which was in 1776, independence was debated, over 21 men from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy observed their operations. They offered advice and guidance. And towards the end of this period, in recognition of the colonists' hard work, they did a ceremony for the Congress, and the Onondaga chief presented John Hancock, who was the president of the Continental Congress, with an Indian name, Karandaran, with a native name. There's also this complication of the word Indian in this conversation. So there's this, and then in 1775, my ancestors are also part of this, of going to Albany and thanking the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for their support. And we have records of that happening. And then much more recently, I think 1980-ish, the U.S. passed a resolution. The U.S. Congress passed a resolution thanking the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for their contributions to the formation of the United States. So there's very little question that they had, particularly the Haudenosaunee, but also others, had a huge influence in the formation of democracy. None of that history was taught to me in school. Within a few years of this tremendous contribution of being actively helped, there was something called the Sullivan Campaign in the lands of the Haudenosaunee peoples, led by George Washington's people, which was essentially a scorched earth campaign that killed hundreds of people and really ruined the cropland. And when you ruin cropland, it's just devastating, right? And the treaties and promises none of those treaties and promises were honored. and like so that and the peoples were continually struggle, like pushed away. And I think this is also really, it's like so many of the values that we think of, like independence and freedom, were values that I think were learned from indigenous people. But what was missing was a deeper understanding of the cosmovision. So the early Americans, the colonists, took some of the ideas and they took some of the structures, if you would, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but they missed the deeper cosmovision. We missed the deeper cosmovision. We missed what is it that they missed how life was at the center. They missed that this was a matrilineal society in which women were at the center. They missed how important women's leadership was. You know, in the beginning in the United States and the formation of the Declaration, like, and the Constitution, women are still property in the United States. That was not how indigenous women were. They were not property. And there was enslavement. People were being enslaved. This country is built on slave labor of enslaved African peoples from Africa. And you know, the initial Constitution does not mention, you know, black men are lesser value than white men. And even indigenous people are often described as like ruthless savages, right? Like, so it's a complex story in which these documents, on the one hand, were taking and borrowing and inspired by, and sometimes explicitly permitted to use indigenous notions of governance, and yet at the same time embedded in those documents is the property system, is effectively land theft. Like, right? Like U.S. property system is effectively land theft. And like, so you have this, so like this country has both of those things. It has both the will of the people, and it has ignoring certain people and saying that certain people don't count and don't matter. And both of those things are wrapped up. But what I think is so powerful is to recognize that, like, democracy as a thing, participatory governance as a thing, is not only from Europe. It is also deeply, deeply, deeply from indigenous communities in what we now think of as the United States, in Turtle Island. And that to be a people who are attaining the quest for self-governance, for participatory governance, is something that was inspired. And that means we can continually, you know, we can, what would it look like, for example, if America started listening to its own indigenous peoples again and started like paying attention to their stories and honoring the promises and honoring the way of life in which Earth is at the center and in which ecology is at the center.
So basically, the celebration of the 4th of July is not somebody leaving, but the early settlers kind of saying we no longer are being controlled by the Europeans. We decide to declare ourselves independent and we will be controlling ourselves. But apart from the fact that a lot of it was borrowed by the Native American community, what becomes of, is the Native American community acknowledged as the first or the original owners? Because you mentioned that the entire US property law is based upon the doctrine of discovery. So is there any acknowledgement of the Native American in the Constitution? Because it's basically one settler saying that we are not affiliated to Europeans now. That's what Independence Day is, right? Because in our case, Independence Day is something else completely.
Right. And it's a huge difference, right? Like, it's a huge difference. And there's a native, I heard this from an Onondaga leader recently, and he says that Oren Lyons, and he said, we were looking at at the British, and we're looking at, our neighbors, and we said, well, this is effectively an argument between father and son. This is an argument between the British crown and the British colonists who were British in origin. Like, this is a family feud. We don't want any part of it. And so they actually wanted to be many of them, wanted to be neutral in the Revolutionary War because they saw this as really someone else's issue. Right? Like, this is a family feud. And it was not independent. It was not the indigenous peoples becoming independent from the British. There was a Pueblo revolt in 1680 in New Mexico, a different part of the country altogether. It was the indigenous people, the Pueblo people, against the Spanish, and they won. They actually won that revolt, and that was a kind of proper revolution against, of an indigenous and local people against a European power, and that was over 100 years earlier, roughly 100 years earlier, and that's not what the Revolutionary War was, right? The Revolutionary War was one European group breaking off from another European group and effectively forming another empire, forming its own power, if you would, its own. And so, like, is there recognition of Native people? It's complex. So on the one hand, treaties, the Haudenosaunee and other leaders fought pretty hard to ensure that treaty rights, the agreements between what becomes the United States, they called it the indigenous people called it the 13 Fires at the time. What becomes the United States and Native nations, they work to shape what was stated in the Constitution, and the rights of the treaty law is considered the highest law of the land. And what I mean by that is, like, the agreement between the United States as a nation and another nation, i.e., indigenous nations, is considered is officially very important, and is to be honored across the United States. They worked hard to ensure that their treaties would be honored. In practice, treaties were not honored, and very rarely honored, if ever. Most people say never honored. There's one or two that were, but basically never honored. And they were, like, the United States continues westward expansion, and in doing so, they're consistently taking native land, right? And so, and it's one of those things where it's like people come here and, like, oh, this is the land of the free. Well, it's like it was the land of the free, like it was. But if you're taking someone's land and building a culture and building a parking lot on top of that, what does that make it? What does that mean for what is the land? You asked this really beautiful question at the beginning. What for the land itself? What does this mean? And I know I have friends who very much feel like the land, until we get rid of property systems, the land is not free, because the land is, so long as the land is brought up and is put into a market economy where it can be bought and sold and developed with no respect whatsoever for the trees and the water, where mountaintop removal is happening and coal mining is happening. So long as that is happening, how can you say that the land itself is free, right? And embedded in the Constitution, embedded in the Declaration, are these ideas, and is this yearning for liberty. And that has, that yearning for liberty has also been a thrust of progress in the United States. It has been a fuel that has enabled the civil rights movement, it enabled the end of slavery. It enabled what become in the Civil War and the end of slavery. It enables, and that notion of freedom, and combined with the continually looking towards indigenous people, because the women's rights movement also comes out of relations and listening to and paying attention to, particularly Haudenosaunee women in New York. And there's some really good, like, lots of historical research on this. So much was inspired and continues to be inspired by Native peoples about how to relate with equality and kindness and respect to the earth. Continues to, like, Indigenous peoples continue to be the leaders in so many of those areas. And I do think more Americans are wanting to listen to that and are feeling, wanting to engage with that. And I meet people all the time who are trying, everyday Americans who are trying to find ways of paying attention and to find ways of using what we have to change what we have. And so there's also this, momentum.
Cool. Thanks a lot. I think we're almost on the clock, on the exact time where you have just mentioned that ordinary Americans are looking at this indigenous wisdom and connection to the land, how people have seen. I think that is very, very important in our times when we talk about response, building resilience, and looking at the entire new climate change response, whether we call it sustainability or resilience or any of these things. It is the indigenous communities anywhere in the world, whether it is in your part of the world or my part of the world or Africa or any other place, which has for a long time not seen land as possession. And everything that you being aware of something doesn't make it your discovery. And that is something that I think very important for us to take back. And because modern Indian economy also reduces every event or every festival or anything into nothing short of just another occasion to consume something. So increasingly we see with the we have now exported a large number of our people to your country. So everything, American holidays are seen with a lot of interest even in India. So American Independence Day is also now another occasion for marketeers to encourage consumption in India. And like I said right at the beginning, that is how the whole thing is. It hardly ever goes beyond that to understand what do we mean by this? What is exactly the independence we are talking about here?
Yeah.
And what was it to the land? And like in our Rate regular podcast, the one persistent value we keep bringing back to is how are we bringing back our relationship with the land again and again?
I think it's one of the most important questions, and it's an important question here too. And how do we, and for here to come into relationship with this land, we have to relate to our history of this land and what's happened here and why is this land the way it is right now? Why is so much pollution? Why is so much overgrown or not well cared for? So much land is not tended well. Our forests are not in good shape. Our land has not been well cared for, and much of that's because the indigenous practices of land management have been lost, or not just lost, but purposefully dismembered, purposefully lost, purposely discounted as not a good way of doing things. And what happened, in those land management practices that America came up with, and by that I mean, people in the United States government, and has influenced the whole world. The whole world has stopped, its traditional ecological management systems. And that, like the United States has a lot to answer for in that regard. And in particular, the colonial mindset and the mindset of extractivism, which is deeply part of colonization, and the separation of people from place. All of these stories are stories of forced removal. And I've been here in the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee, and it's like, First, they remove the people, the Cherokee people, from these lands, from these hills and these mountains, and then they took out the coal, right? and then they took the coal, and then the coal has led, that burning of that coal has led to climate change. And because that wasn't enough, then they are now removing the tops of mountains, right? For mountaintop removal. It's a horrific thing. It's just disgusting. And that is impacting the people, the American white folks who live there, tremendously influenced by this, right? And now this time in 4th of July is the hottest 4th of July on record. And many places are, because of climate change, it's a tremendous heat dome, much suffering, much pain. And, many fireworks celebrations are having to be canceled this 4th of July. And yet, the current administration is trying to have the biggest firework display ever. They're nailing down. And there has been an announcement from the National Park Service, which has said, basically, this many fireworks in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, is going to create hazardous air quality. So you shouldn't go into the nation's capital on 4th of July because of the firework display. The National Park Service is saying this at the same time that the president is saying, "Oh, we're going to have the biggest firework display ever." All these shells, right? It's like, and this is like what we're going to, and he's going to give the longest speech ever, he promises. And for like over 100-degree weather here. I don't know what that is in Celsius, but it's just, it's unbelievably hot. And the National Park Service is like, "Oh, that's going to be hazardous." So like they're making it so you can't breathe again, and again, right? So there is this thrust of domination that is getting stronger in this moment, of climate change. That seems to be, it's saying, no, we're just going to continue. We're just going to continue destroying these mountains, even though it's causing all of the suffering, because it's going to make a few people rich. But that's not what the people want. The people want healthy air and healthy water and healthy land. And they don't always know how to get it, and they're usually too exhausted to do much about it. But the people and the land are asking for something different. And it doesn't take much to hear that once you know where to listen.
On that note, thank you
All
very
right.
much. Thanks a lot for joining. And Bhaskar, any last words?
Yeah. Thank you, Sara, for sharing your thought with such openness and honesty. Since we started Ratai 3 years back, we keep on engaging in this ground, how people are disconnected from land and language, memory, all these things. So all of our Ratai listeners, it was a meaningful conversation done by Ram and Sara. So keep listening and keep questioning us. So history is not only about past, it continues, lives in the land, memory, and its people. So carry the question today. Thank you. We will meet again in an important conversation.
Yeah, probably we'll meet some other time and have another conversation around many of the threads that you spoke about today. Thanks a lot for joining. Have a wonderful day, and don't go to Washington and celebrate wherever you are, in some nice place where you can breathe the air still and feel the freedom of the birds and the waters in whichever part, maybe in your beautiful Hudson Valley. Thanks a lot and have a wonderful day and weekend.
Thank you.